Welcome to Consciousness, the DSR Network podcast focusing on the artificial intelligence revolution, politics, and policy.
This podcast is underwritten in part by the U.S. Embassy of the United Arab Emirates. Its editorial content is completely independent, and the views expressed are exclusively those of participating experts. It is presented live, without editing. For further information about the UAE's efforts in the areas of artificial intelligence and technology, go to the website of the embassy at www.uae-embassy.org and search for UAE-US Tech Cooperation. We thank them for their support. We thank everybody who's supporting this podcast for their support, and we look forward to it developing and growing over time because the issue is so important. Hello and welcome to Consciousness. I'm David Rothkopf, your host. Each week we talk about different issues associated with artificial intelligence, often associated with the intersection of artificial intelligence and policy. And for that reason, we're extremely happy to have joining us today Professor Sandra Wachter. She is a professor of technology and regulation at the Oxford Internet Institute, specializing in the legal and ethical implications of AI, big data, robotics, and platform regulation. Hi, Sandra. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Good. Thank you for joining us. We talk a lot about these issues here. I think we come at all of them from the perspective that these are pretty early days, that most people are not quite sure what artificial intelligence is, including many policymakers. And so that has us in a situation where we're sort of lagging technology in our responses to it from the perspective of what we ought to be doing as a society to protect ourselves and to ensure the integrity of what happens. And so I guess, to start out with the most general possible question, I'd like to ask him, do you agree with that thesis? And do you agree that we are, broadly speaking, globally behind where we ought to be on addressing, ethical, regulatory issues associated with AI?
Yes, I think maybe behind is maybe too negative, but I think it is no time is the present to start regulating in the right direction. Mm-hmm. I think we are at that magical point where we have a good grasp to understand the positive and the negative side of it, and also have ideas of how to mitigate the bad stuff while still enabling the good stuff. And I think if we waited much longer, it'd be harder to start finding that middle ground. And if we had started earlier, it probably would have stifled, development in a way. So I think we are at that sweet spot right now where it's pivotal to start acting on regulation.
So there's several big buckets of regulation that we ought to address ourselves to. I would characterize one of them safety, one of them as privacy, one of them as ethics, anti-discrimination, anti-algorithmic discrimination. Those three come up the most frequently.
Yes.
Do you agree that those are the three big buckets that we ought to be addressing?
They are definitely among the biggest buckets. I think there are more buckets than that. I think the privacy concern is definitely true. The discrimination stuff is really, really important. But other things like explainability, so understanding the black box. If you have to go to prison because AI says so, you might want to know how this decision was actually made. So that's going to be really, really important to understand a little bit better. The environmental impact of those systems is also something that we couldn't underestimate, especially with Gen AI that cost more resources than traditional systems. And I think there's
Well, we can throw in disinformation too. I suppose.
disinformation. Yes, absolutely. Especially
Right.
with Gen AI is definitely also on the rise. And then just bigger societal issues of like, what does happen to the workforce if we have systems that are really good at doing certain tasks or cheaper or better than humans? Like, what does the future of work look like? And all those things, I think we have to think about at the same time.
Yeah. So, as we grapple with these things, we come at them with some similar problems or challenges from a global perspective than we faced with the internet and some other things. And that is that, there's kind of, again, I'm oversimplifying. It's only a half-hour podcast, but they're kind of three major political, business, ethical philosophies that drive things on the planet right now. There's a European perspective, which is very heavily oriented towards protecting the individual. There is an American perspective, which is more heavily oriented towards enabling the corporate provider, and the individual has to take some steps to protect themselves. And then there is what I would call the Chinese or more authoritarian perspective, which believes that everything is really the province of the state and the state can do whatever they want. Again, do you think that's the right kind of way to look at this? And if so, how's the tug of war between these different perspectives playing out?
Yeah. So I'm not too uncomfortable with the idea of having different frameworks in different countries. I'm a lawyer. That's just how things have always been. Different cultures have different traditions, different value systems, and they have to choose the mechanisms that make most sense for them. And so in Europe, we were very comfortable with having the safety product approach. The US and in the UK, also my adopted home here, is much more open to the idea to leaving it to companies to self-regulate. And the Chinese system is different to that as well. And so there's nothing really problematic about that, because that there is no inherent better version of how to regulate a system. I think the only thing that I worry more about is that we start seeing it as a problem and see it more as an opportunity. We should see it as an opportunity to think about those issues that really transcend geography, right? All the issues that we just spoken about, explainability issues, privacy issues, discrimination issues, the impact on the environment, that happens regardless if you're in Europe, in China, or in the US, right? And those are global problems. So at some point, it would be good just to have a conversation, like a global conversation, to find an understanding on how to work on that issue together. And I think that's where I hope the future will lie. And we have had this in the past, like human rights usually started to flourish locally and then spread out to be more international. And so I hope at some point we will all see this as a human problem that really transcends geography.
Yeah, I hope you're right. But as we've seen with the internet, which has been around a little bit longer, we haven't resolved those issues, and we've kind of avoided having the global conversation. And this is different, in my view, from the internet, because the internet is a technology. It's kind of a vertical issue, whereas artificial intelligence is transformational in kind of a horizontal way. It changes what a job is, how economics works, how politics works, how changes everything. And so the ramifications of decisions are much, much broader. But as you say, we're in the early phases of this. Do you see a place that you say they're getting it right? They're kind of, a place people should visit to discover best practices.
Yeah, I think it's probably too early to say, because we really just started like very recently. I think I can talk a little bit about what's happening in Europe, because that's the standards that I'm most familiar with, and how that will play out is also something that is, to be seen. One of the things that I particularly like about the European approach is that there are certain things that developers have to adhere to before they let products come to market. And so it's trying to walk away from the idea, let's just put something on the market. If something bad happens, you go to court and sue, rather trying to come up with certain standards that, those systems have to adhere to before it's safe to use them in certain areas. And so in my opinion, that's something that I potentially really like. And I think something that we probably missed a little bit with the social media internet platform regulation approach, where we just waited way too long until it was really clear what issues are existent. And then we started to think about it, and then it was already too late, probably. And so I think we can learn maybe from that example that wasn't the best idea to deal with, what we have now with platforms everywhere. Hopefully thinking about those issues in a different way and be more proactive rather than reactive, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. I have, because I'm an American, I have to ask you a sort of American-centric question, because it's just the way we are. It's national narcissism. But we're 2 weeks away from an election here, and I would argue that although the past 4 years has seen some activity in these areas in the United States, it's all been super preliminary. The White House put out an executive order, and it said, we really ought to do something about it. It didn't say what we ought to do. It said every agency of the government needs to look into this and come up with a policy. There are a couple of very sort of narrow safety and privacy issues that have come up, but most of them tend to be kind of false analogies in my mind. It's like, well, there was child safety on the internet. Let's do child safety on AI, as opposed to things that have to do with AI. So, I think that the next administration would, however that turns out, and I will just, we're praying and lighting candles and hoping that it turns out in the right way here, but is going to have AI as a much more central issue in many more areas for the first time. It's really going to have to tackle it. And so that this time, people start saying, well, what should the administration do in its first 100 days? What should the priorities be to sort of set them on the right track? If you were giving advice to the next president, let's just, because I can't handle the alternative, let's just assume it's Kamala Harris. What would you say?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would it will be a high level thing and then a concrete thing. I think the high level thing is that we really have to fight this narrative of that regulation stifles innovation. That's like as an inherent thing, not something that is necessarily true. Good regulation actually enables very ethical innovation. And so the example that I often use is the car example, right? That when cars were first manufactured and then seatbelts were becoming mandatory, people were saying that is something that stifles innovation. But nowadays, nobody would really buy a car anymore if it doesn't have a seatbelt. And that's a similar way how I think about AI regulation as well. Nobody wins if you have racist AI. Nobody wins if you have biased AI. Nobody wins if you have unexplainable AI. Nobody wins if you have AI that is destroying the planet or is harmful to people. Right? Those regulations are not in place to hold something back that is good. It's trying to hold something back that is harmful. And so very often, actually, the nudge from governmental side to create systems that are more equitable and fair and transparent and explainable also makes the product better in the end, right? And at some point, this will be a competitive advantage as well. And so I think that's hopefully something that will resolve over time, that those 2 points, society and the rights of the individual, are always in combat, which I don't think they are. And then it's going to be really important to just see that there are certain issues that just really need addressing. And if we don't do that now, it could just be very, very harmful for people. And that's really something that goes beyond politics, beyond party lines. It's really something that is a human issue. And so that's just really, really important, because so much harm could happen if we don't have systems that are safe and equitable and fair and transparent.
Well, more broadly, it raises a question, which is, well, let me put it this way. There was an American novelist named Jack London who wrote a lot of stories about people in the Arctic, exploring in the Arctic. And these were often, very cold, wintry stories. And there was a guy in a sled. And at one point, they talk about how do you deal with the threats associated with it. And one of the characters says, you have to deal with the wolf closest to the sled. In other words, the most imminent issue, right?
Yeah.
So with regard to AI right now, what do you think is the wolf closest to the sled?
I think bias. Honestly, I think bias is probably the most imminent problem that we need to address, because I cannot think of a system that doesn't have bias. And that just comes back to the fact how technology works. As soon as you understand a little bit how an algorithm works, you understand that it's almost impossible to have an unbiased system. Because in reality, what an algorithm is doing is looking at the past, trying to predict the future. So you feed the algorithm with historical data that you have. For example, you want to give people a loan or a job or have to send them to prison. You feed this algorithm with past decisions of who you have hired, who you have given loans to, who you have admitted to university. And you try to find out what decision patterns exist. And you use those patterns to make new decisions. So basically, you're making the same decision of the past in the future again. And so for some people, past decisions
you're institutionalizing past biases, right?
Yes. You do. And so I can't really think of an area in our society that has been in the past equitable and fair for everybody. And so I would actually, throw it on its head and say, unless you can prove the opposite, I'm going to assume your system has a problem. And so that's been something that I've been advocating for, rather than somebody having to come in and prove that there is an issue. I think developers should be responsible of proving that there isn't. And again, just because there is an issue doesn't mean that it has to be banned or that there have to be fines, but we have to be open to the fact that probably your system has a problem. And then it's a question how we deal with that problem. And that's something that has been very, let's say, frustrating in my work, because very often you still need to convince people that bias is something that exists in our society, because many people just don't see it or are not aware of it or don't experience it or are not aware of their own biases. And so that's also just a big issue here, that it's almost like an invisible thing for many, many people, paired with the fact that people think, data is neutral and math is fair. And so it's definitely better than a human and more fair than a human, when in reality, it's just replicating the unfairness that a human used to do in the past. And I think so that's one of the biggest areas that we have to worry about.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Now, here, like in Washington, there have been a lot of sort of Silicon Valley types who, first of all, they try to avoid Washington. Then they realize they have to deal with Washington. So they come in, they set up little think tanks. Because you're in this field, there have been a bunch of think tanks set up around this. And a disproportionate number of them would have said, well, no, the issue is safety because we have to ensure that AI doesn't kill us all. And part of the reason they say this is that there is a remote chance it could. But part of the reason they say this is they don't want to talk about other things. They want to deflect the conversation. Yeah. How would you respond to this centrality that the safety issue has had versus some of these other issues that may seem slightly more mundane, but will actually touch hundreds of millions or billions of more lives more quickly?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's definitely some, tribalism going on, where some camps say that we have to worry about a very distant future, almost akin to science fiction scenarios where AI maybe wakes up and develops a conscience of its own and a will of its own. And as soon as it wakes up, it wants to kill us, which is also an interesting thing just to let sink in, kind of. That's, something that, at least from the research that we have right now, is not something that we have to worry about. But there are certain things that we already have to worry about right now, where people are going to prison because of biased algorithms. They're not getting loans because of algorithms. They're not getting jobs because of biased algorithms. Those are issues that affect everybody already around the world. And so the deflection is working, because you're saying, oh, just look at this far future scenario that we don't know will happen, and if it happens, what will happen, rather than looking at the problem that we already have right here. Because also, it's convenient because you don't actually have to change anything. Because how would your business practice change with this remote possibility of AI waking up? Nobody's really doing something about that. Whereas thinking about what it means for equity and like fairness and equality, you would probably need to make a lot of changes to make those systems much fairer. And that's definitely a convenient thing to deflect and look at the far end of the future, of an unrealistic future, rather than dealing with the issues that we have right now.
Yeah, no, I love all the conferences that take place on frontier AI, which essentially means as you go in the front door, we don't know what we're talking about. So they're very, very abstract. I have my own personal concern. I was a senior economic official in the U.S. government, and I focused on, although I focused mostly on national security, I focused on economic issues too. My personal concern is that the bias that is the most extreme bias, and that is not just sort of latent based on tradition or habit, but is something that is actually actively acted upon, is to increase the advantages of the wealthy at the expense of the economically disenfranchised. And then when I look at AI, I say, well, the technology costs a lot of money. The energy costs a lot of money. The brain power costs a lot of money. Only richer corporations will have a big advantage over poorer corporations. Richer people will have a huge advantage. This will translate into market advantages, not financial markets, but also other kinds of market advantage. And rich countries will have an advantage. When I talk to leaders from emerging countries, they're very worried that that you've heard this term data slaves, that they're going to turn into second-class citizens in this world. And that it's not just algorithmic biases. It's the associated economic factors that will limit who has access to this. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I would unfortunately not disagree with you at all. If you look at Virginia Eubanks or Kathy O'Neill's work, those were some of the first people that already in 2015, I want to say, started pointing out exactly that issue, that this is going to be something that predominantly affects people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Predominantly also because very often the areas that are under a lot of restraints or pressures to cut budgets are the ones that are implementing AI as quickly as possible. That means schools, that means public health, that means criminal justice. And so having those systems in place is then perpetrating the inequalities of those communities even further. And so then you're in a situation where probably dealing with an algorithm on a daily basis, be it as your job or as your loan manager or as your parole officer or as your judge, becomes more and more normalized, whereas probably the ones that are better off are the ones that still have like human contact and really have the ability to engage with people. So I would definitely agree that there is a divide there. I would also think it's important to think about just how everybody's lives are going to be different if like just AI takes up a lot of the tasks that we do in our daily jobs, and how our job quality is going to change, right? Is it that you're going to have a system that is a quote unquote co-pilot that helps you with difficult tasks? Or are you going to be a babysitter of an algorithm, basically checking if the machine is correct? Is that a job that people actually want to have? Like, how does automation actually affect the job quality? And what kind of jobs are being automated away, again, leaning towards the ones that probably are not in the higher financial income class?
Well, also one of the fallacies I think that's around at the moment is people put in these AI systems and they say, well, human beings will supervise them. So don't worry, somebody will look at it. But what we've already seen in a number of examples is that people don't. At a certain point, they start saying, oh, no, the system's pretty good. And, I mean, you may recall these stories that came about the Israelis using AI for targeting artillery. And, they were supposed to all be overseen. But what happened was they said, nah, that's just fine. So let's do 100 where we used to do 10.
Yeah.
And that's another problem, right?
Definitely. Yeah, we have automation bias and technology bias. So that means we just tend to trust technology more than we should, just because it seems neutral and because it seems fair or unbiased or less biased and that type of stuff, which is not really true. And so we tend to trust them more. And also, it's a good way to shed yourself from responsibility, or from having to grapple with the decision yourself. If you can just say, well, the algorithm told me so, rather than taking it upon yourself to divert from what the algorithm actually has said. It's definitely also inviting to just not having to deal with those issues yourself anymore. And, I also think that's probably what's going to happen.
Yeah. So one other thing that we I knew this was going to happen. We start talking. There are 100 things to go over, and I get to go over 3 of them. So someday we'll invite you back. I hope you'll come. But let me deal with one other issue, which I've just had a number of conversations about this week, which is yet another problem area. And that is that we seem to be entering the area of AI with governments saying, well, this is a strategic advantage for us. And so it is in our interest to withhold AI technology from other people. So the United States, for example, says, well, we don't want China to get this stuff. So we're going to be very careful about how we regulate selling the chips that are associated with AI, NVIDIA chips and other kinds of chips. And one foreign leader said to me that the U.S. is treating these chips like plutonium. We're regulating it in that same kind of way. But what that can also lead to is two-speed world, a have and have not world, a world where those with the technology, you could easily see the U.S. going to Europeans and saying, well, look, we're all in this together. You can't sell this stuff to the Chinese. And then the Chinese will say, well, okay, we have to develop it ourselves. And then, they're like, well, we want to have the emerging world sort of using our systems and our technology as opposed to their systems. And we get into this kind of tech Cold War mentality. What's your thought about that?
Yeah, I think it's already a problem that we call it war, right? Because it already assumes we are at war. And when you add war, then probably things will escalate at some point. And that's really not the right way, because once you're in that mindset, the only argument is let's destroy the world faster than the other ones. And that can't be like the solution of good technology. Like that's already like a wrong way to think about it. And so I think what's will be much better. And I think that's really something that you can't do with like tech regulation. So the AI Act won't do that, because that's really not the purpose of it. What you actually need is diplomats and international collaboration. So bringing people from around the world around the table to discuss how certain issues just concern us all. So rather than getting like caught up in a downward spiral of just trying to be the first at being destructive, it'd be better to think about the fact that we only have one planet. So if that one goes bust, that's it, basically. And so if we have those systems that discriminate against populations, then all of the populations suffer, right? Millions and billions of people suffer because of that. And so that's really, really a human problem. So it should be something to bring people really together and see it as a humanistic problem, rather than trying to outcompete the other nation in its destructive nature. But again, that just needs a mind shift, moving away from that Cold War thing, rather than thinking about like a communal effort to do that. And that's probably it's a tall order. I understand that. But if we just rely on that mentality of warfare, then we're just going to stay in battle forever, I think.
I'm so glad you're out there doing the work that you're doing.
Oh, thank you.
And I think it's so important. And I hope that people who are listening to this will follow your work and follow what you're doing. And I hope that you will come back and we
Oh,
can
if you invite
continue
me,
this
I'll be back in a
conversation.
second.
Okay, well, we will invite you for sure. It was a great conversation. Thank you very, very much, Sandra. And
Anytime.
thank you, everybody, for listening. And of course, we'll be back each and every week with additional episodes of Scylla Consciousness. Until then, bye-bye.